Hello, hello. Wonderful to have you here. I hope you're having a great day. Today, what I was thinking of discussing is how many hindrances are there in early Buddhism? And what are those hindrances? Now, first of all, what are the hindrances? The hindrances are things that make it difficult for us to attain meditation, to meditate properly, to meditate successfully, if you like. Or maybe more accurately, they hinder us from being able to attain deep states of meditative absorption. So they're important practices. The Buddha also termed them the armies of Mara. Mara being this figurehead, a sort of a personalization of these difficulties that the Buddha had in meditating, and that he had to overcome in order to attain enlightenment. So they're exceedingly important for practice to at least know what they are. Now, I've done several videos in the past on the hindrances, on aspects of the hindrances, and I think we all expect there to be a certain number of them. Traditionally, there are 5. But what we're going to see today is that that's not always the case. Now, the 5 traditional hindrances are said to be sense desire, desiring things around us, greed for things in our environment, ill will or forms of anger, restlessness and remorse, which is one that I think we all know. We get restless, or maybe we'll be remorseful for something in the past, dullness and drowsiness, or just being tired, sleepy, and doubt. Now, this list of 5, if you look at it a different way, looks like 7, because there are a couple that seem to be pairs of things, but let's leave that aside. It's understood that there are 5, and that's just that's just the way the list is. 5 or 7, however you like to call it. There is, however, a different text in which there's a bit larger number of these. Now, in this sutta, the Buddha discusses in perhaps the most detail anywhere about his struggles with attaining deep states of meditation, the ones that were necessary for him to attain enlightenment. He goes into quite a bit of detail about his own past meditative history. Now, this sutta is also the same sutta that I discussed in a prior video, in which it's claimed that there are basically 5 jhanas, 5 states of deep meditative absorption, rather than the traditional 4. So the fact that there are more hindrances than normal and more jhanas than normal in this text makes it something of an odd text. And I'll get back to a bit of that at the end of this video. Now, in this text, the Buddha is trying to teach and exhort one of his disciples, a man named Anuruddha, and help him to attain jhana. Now, jhana is traditionally and typically understood to arise after the experience of certain kinds of what are known as signs. The Pali word is nimitta. These are sort of visions, or at least they can be, visions of forms or lights within, underneath your closed eyes. So you have your eyelids closed, but you see these visions of lights or forms arise before you, and these are taken to be signs that jhana is close, that you're close to achieving the state that you want to achieve. And what Anuruddha says is that he achieves these signs, but that he can't maintain them. And as a result, the signs die away, and he isn't able to get to the next stage, which is achieving the jhanas. And the Buddha responds to Anuruddha by saying that the same thing had happened to him when he was an unenlightened bodhisattva. That is, that he had these signs, and that they would continually disappear on him, and he wasn't able to get further. What he said was that he began to understand that the reason that they disappeared was because of these hindrances, or what he terms mental impurities of one kind or another. And so the Buddha goes through the various of these mental impurities that he had to overcome, and eventually he basically counts 11 of them, which is quite a bit more than 5. And each of these hindrances basically caused the Buddha's concentration to fall apart, and without concentration he was not able to maintain the state. Now, in some of these, the Buddha gives a short simile explaining how we're supposed to understand the hindrance in question, but not all of them. Also, it's important to keep in mind that there are various recensions of this text, various versions of the text. One of them is in Chinese. And the scholar of early Buddhism, Bhikkhu Analayo, has done a comparative study and revealed certain differences between the Pali version of this text and the Chinese version. I'll be discussing some of that as we go along. Now, since there are 11 of these hindrances, I'm not going to go through each of them in detail. There isn't, in fact, a lot of information about each of them in the text. But so, at least I think we should know what they are. And if we want to know more, we're going to probably have to do some research. And I'll give you what I can, at least in short, in this video. So the first of these hindrances in this list is doubt. Now, doubt is also one of the 5 traditional hindrances, so this is in both lists, or in every list. In the Pali version of this text, it's not described what doubt is. They don't go into any detail. However, the Chinese version, interestingly, says that the doubt arose for the Buddha because he was having these visions of forms and lights, and he was realizing that they were not real, that they were essentially illusions of some kind, and as a result he began to have doubts about his practice. The second of these is inattention, which is not explained, but I think we can understand that if you don't pay attention to what's going on during your practice, you're probably not going to be successful with it. The third is dullness and drowsiness, which, as we've already seen, is one of, again, the 5 traditional hindrances. Being sleepy is definitely going to hinder your ability to maintain and achieve any kind of deep state of meditative absorption. So again, no real question there. The fourth of these hindrances is terror, which is quite surprising because we really don't have, to my knowledge, any descriptions of people being terrified while trying to achieve deep states of meditative absorption, at least in the texts, except for here. The Buddha gives a short simile here. He says that it's as if you're basically walking down a road and 2 killers were to jump out at you from either side and try to kill you. It's that kind of terror that beset the Buddha when he was doing this practice. The fifth is elation. That is, the fifth of these hindrances is the hindrance of elation, being too elated by the experience that he's having. And once again, the Buddha gives a short simile here. He says that it's as if you were looking for some hidden treasure and expected that there would be one way to get to this treasure, perhaps it's buried somewhere in a cave, and you were to find that in fact there were 5 different ways to get to this buried treasure, that it was much easier than you had thought before. Well, then you would be elated. And presumably the elation that perhaps came when the Buddha would have one of these experiences of this sign that would come up in front of him, he would get carried away with elation of, oh, I've achieved the sign. Well, that elation will then become a hindrance to you. It will cause the sign to disappear. The sixth of these, there's some issue about translating the exact term. The term is usually translated, to my knowledge, inertia. And the commentary to this text describes this inertia as like what happens to you after a large meal. So I think we understand that, inertia being sort of weighed down, perhaps by eating too much. It's similar perhaps to dullness and drowsiness, sort of not being able to continue on with the practice because you're sort of too full in some sense. The scholar translator Bhikkhu Sujato has translated this hindrance as discomfort. Again, perhaps because of the commentary, he's thinking that, okay, this is like the discomfort that you might have after eating a large meal. If you're uncomfortable, you're not going to be able to practice properly. The seventh of these is said to be excessive effort. And the simile that goes along with this talks about how if you grip a quail, that is a small bird, in both of your hands and grip it too tightly, you're going to kill that bird. In the same way, if you practice with excessive effort, you're liable not to be successful. We have a word in English sometimes used in the sort of practice tradition in Buddhism of efforting. Efforting is sort of putting too much effort, too much of a sense of yourself and what you're doing, pushing too hard. That is usually not going to bring success because it's involved with this kind of a greed on your part of wanting too much, wanting it too quickly. Effort should be balanced. And to that extent, the next of these stages, the 8th one, is insufficient effort. If we put in insufficient effort, the simile goes, it's like holding a quail in your hands too loosely. And of course, we all know if you hold a bird too loosely, it's going to fly away. In the same way, if you make insufficient effort, you're not going to get where you want to be. Now, the 9th of these hindrances is somewhat confusing. In the Pali, it's said to be longing. Longing. It's not exactly clear what that means. There's no simile involved with it or associated with it. Perhaps it means that we're pining for enlightenment too much. We're too greedy or too sort of sad or whatever it is, longing, sort of depressed in our own state right now. Maybe that's it. It's not clear. However, one clue, I think, to the fact that this is not an easy thing to understand is that, in fact, in the Chinese, it's an entirely different term. The Chinese version of this text has conceit here, where longing is in the Pali. And conceit is one of the major higher fetters that we have to overcome in order to attain enlightenment. So whatever we're going through with our practice of deep states of meditative absorption, we're certainly going to have to overcome conceit eventually. Now, what is conceit? Conceit is, at least in one way of looking at it, the comparing mind, our tendency to see ourselves as a fixed entity, a fixed self, in comparison to other people, either as being better than them, or as being not as good as them, or even as being equal to them. All of these are ways of sort of having a comparing mind, and all of these are therefore elements of conceit. And so if we get caught up in conceit around our meditation practice, that is going to hinder us from attaining deep states of absorption. The 10th of these hindrances is said to be perception of diversity. Again, this is not entirely clear what this means. However, what we do know, certainly is the case, that these deep states of absorption are states in which the mind is supposed to be or needs to be unified, needs to be gathered together, shouldn't be dispersed on many different things and going from one thing to another. And so if we are, during our meditation, thinking too much about diverse things, something here, something over there, this idea, this perception, that perception, then we're going to have trouble unifying the mind to the extent necessary to become really absorbed in our meditation. Now, the 11th of these, the final one, is once again something of a conundrum. In the Pali tradition, it's said to be excessive meditation on forms. What exactly this means is once again a question. Perhaps what it means is that we are in the state where we're having these experiences, these signs that are themselves sort of visual forms, and that if we spend too much time meditating on them or investigating them or contemplating them, that we're never going to penetrate them and get through them and get to the jhana. So in other words, we have to see these forms as simply a passing phase and then get beyond them. That's one way to understand it. However, one problem here is that the Chinese version of this text says that the 11th of these hindrances is not contemplating forms. So it sounds rather like the opposite, right? One says excessive contemplation of forms or excessive meditation on forms, and the other one says not contemplating forms. And perhaps the Chinese one is sort of a different example here, where we have the experience of form, these signs in front of us, and we're not willing to contemplate them. We're not willing to deal with them, and so we're not able to get through them. But that's just a speculation on my part. Now, no doubt, some of these problems with these 11 hindrances can be overcome by a practitioner going through the practice of attaining these states of jhana, of deep absorption, and finding out for themselves, finding out for ourselves what things hinder us and what things don't. And that way we can perhaps get an idea of what these might mean. That is, again, through practice. But if we're going to take that route, I would caution you not to assume that everybody has the same experience you do. In discussions, online discussions, discussions in texts that I've seen about jhana, about meditative absorption generally, there's a lot of people who are very dogmatic about their own experience and assume that other people have the same that we do. And I think we should strive not to be dogmatic about this and assume that everyone may have their own experience, which is somewhat different. And in that way, different people may well have different interpretations of each of these hindrances, and these interpretations may not be reconcilable because, again, people's experience may not be the same. Now, what do I make of the fact that this sutta has a larger number of hindrances than the traditional list of 5? Especially given that this sutta also seems to say that there are 5 jhanas instead of the traditional list of 4. Now, I've heard one scholar argue to me that this shows that this is probably a late text, because he says that it's understood that in the Abhidhamma, which is a later tradition, there are often said to be 5 jhanas. In other words, they split the first jhana into 2, which is understood to be something of an analytic move that's made, perhaps, this scholar suggests, by later scholar practitioners after the Buddha's day who want to sort of finely refine everything into all the possible ways it can appear. And so they've come up with more jhanas, and so that perhaps percolated back into this text. My own interpretation is somewhat different. Of course, this is just speculation, and I don't have any proof of this, but my own interpretation is rather that this is more likely to be a somewhat earlier text, as the scholar Piatan suggests in one of his writings. That is, the tradition that preserved these texts was very conservative in its bent, and was unlikely, I think, as a result, to simply make up an extra, 6 hindrances or make up an extra jhana when the traditional lists were much shorter. I think that's unlikely. However, it is, I think, not outside the realm of possibility that in an early recounting, an early discourse, the Buddha might indeed have been quite expansive in giving a long list of these things, but that over time in the tradition, these lists got pared down to their essential core. Now, Piatan, in one of his pieces, I'll leave a link to all this stuff down below in the notes, by the way, Piatan describes how all of these 11 hindrances can be subsumed into the 5 hindrances if we sort of understand them a certain way, and undoubtedly he's correct about that. So it's not like these are completely different, but they're different enough that I think it could be a window on an early Buddhist practice, and perhaps even a window on the Buddha's own path towards attaining enlightenment, where he was trying to achieve these deep states of meditation. Now, I think what we're left with are questions about how to overcome these hindrances. And in this text, that's not really described. It's simply said that, these hindrances are eventually overcome. However, there are texts that describe ways of overcoming, in particular, the traditional list of 5 hindrances. And I did a video a while back about how to overcome these 5 hindrances, at least in these early texts. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or want to see it again. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.